It was the summer of 1985, and the world seemed to be changing faster than ever. Ronald Carter, a 34-year-old teacher living in Atlanta, had just been promoted to assistant principal at his local high school. His career was stable, his finances were in order, but deep down he felt an emptiness gnawing at him. He had been married once, briefly, but the marriage had fallen apart after only 2 years. He never remarried, never had children of his own. Still, he had always felt drawn to the idea of being a father. That June, while volunteering at a community center, Ronald learned about 3 young sisters, Angela, 8, Simone, 6, and Dawn, just 3 years old, who had recently lost their mother. Their father had disappeared long before, and now they were caught in the foster system, drifting from one temporary home to another. Ronald remembered the first time he saw them. Angela, the eldest, sat protectively with her arms wrapped around Simone and Dawn, her big brown eyes filled with both fear and defiance. Simone, with her curly hair tied into messy pigtails, seemed restless, constantly glancing around the room as if searching for an escape. Dawn, the baby of the trio, clung to a ragged teddy bear, her thumb in her mouth. Most people who inquired about adoption were hesitant to take siblings, especially 3 children at once. Many potential parents wanted only babies, or at most one child. The social workers were blunt. If the girls weren't adopted soon, they would likely be split up. Ronald went home that night unable to sleep. He thought about his own childhood. His mother had raised him single-handedly after his father abandoned them. He knew the pain of being left behind, of wondering why you weren't enough for someone to stay. Looking into those girls' eyes had stirred something deep inside him, a sense of responsibility, almost destiny. 2 months later, despite warnings from friends and even his own family, Ronald made the decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He filed papers to adopt all 3 sisters. It wasn't easy. Some people questioned his motives. Why would a single black man adopt 3 little girls? Don't you think it'll be too much? Others whispered. The process was long and grueling. Home visits, interviews, financial checks, psychological evaluations. It was as if every detail of his life had to be examined under a magnifying glass. But Ronald refused to back down. By November of 1985, the adoption was finalized. He became their legal father. That evening, he took them to his modest home in Atlanta, a small 2-bedroom house with peeling paint and creaky floors. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The first night was awkward. Angela refused to unpack, muttering, "We'll probably have to move again anyway." Simone asked endless questions. "Do we have to call you Dad? What if we don't like it here? Do you have rules?" And little Dawn simply cried until she fell asleep in Ronald's arms. Ronald didn't blame them. Trust wasn't something you could demand, it had to be earned. So he started small. He cooked breakfast every morning, pancakes on Sundays, cereal on busy school days. He walked them to school, cheering at their sports games, sitting through choir recitals even when his work piled up. He learned how to braid hair from a neighbor, fumbling clumsily at first but improving with time. The challenges were endless. Money was tight, and 3 growing girls meant constant expenses, clothes, school supplies, doctor visits. Angela struggled with anger and often lashed out, slamming doors and refusing to listen. Simone had nightmares and trouble concentrating in school. Dawn, though sweet, clung to him desperately, afraid to be left alone for even a moment. But amid the chaos, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly, the girls started to believe. They started to trust. They started to laugh again. One evening, about a year after the adoption, Ronald came home to find a drawing taped to the fridge. In crayon, the girls had scrawled, "Our family, Daddy plus us." It was the first time they had called him Daddy. Ronald stood in the kitchen staring at the drawing, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in years, he felt whole. What Ronald didn't know then was just how extraordinary their journey together would be. Over the next 4 decades, those 3 little girls would grow into remarkable women, carrying with them the lessons of love, resilience, and the power of chosen family. But the road ahead would be filled with trials, triumphs, heartbreaks, and miracles that no one could have predicted back in 1985. By the early 1990s, the Carter household had grown into a noisy, chaotic, but love-filled home. Ronald had moved into a larger house, still modest but with enough space for everyone. The girls were no longer wide-eyed children. Angela was now a teenager of 14, Simone was 12, and Dawn was 9. And with adolescence came storms that Ronald could never have anticipated. Angela, the eldest, had always carried the weight of being the protector. That responsibility had left her wary, distrustful, and sometimes combative. At school, she excelled academically but struggled socially. "People look at me and see trouble," she once confided to Ronald. "They think because I don't have a real mom and dad, I must be broken." Ronald tried to reassure her, but Angela's anger often erupted in unpredictable ways. She skipped classes, slammed doors, and once even shouted, "You're not my real father." Before storming out into the night, Ronald found her hours later sitting on a park bench, crying. He sat beside her quietly, offering no lecture, just his presence. Eventually, she whispered, "I'm scared, Daddy. What if you leave like everyone else?" That night, Ronald promised her, again and again, that he would never walk away. Simone, meanwhile, was becoming the dreamer of the family. She had discovered a love for music, particularly singing. She would spend hours in her room belting out Whitney Houston's songs into a hairbrush. Ronald encouraged her passion, scraping together enough money to enroll her in voice lessons. But Simone was also sensitive, almost fragile. She longed for approval and often felt overshadowed by Angela's boldness or Dawn's sweetness. In middle school, she faced cruel bullying. Kids mocked her dark skin, her secondhand clothes, and even her adoption. She came home one afternoon in tears, sobbing, "Why can't I just be normal?" Ronald hugged her tightly. "Baby, you don't need to be normal. You need to be you. And you're already extraordinary." Slowly, those words became a shield she carried into adulthood. Dawn, the youngest, remained the light of the family. Cheerful and curious, she followed her sisters around constantly, eager to prove she could keep up. But her attachment to Ronald deepened into anxiety. She worried excessively whenever he was late, always fearing the worst. Once, after Ronald got caught in traffic and arrived home an hour late, Dawn had been pacing the living room with tears streaming down her face. "I thought you weren't coming back," she confessed, clinging to him like she had on the first night in 1985. Raising 3 daughters alone was no small feat. Ronald sacrificed everything, his social life, dating, even career opportunities, just to be present. He became both mother and father, disciplinarian and nurturer, cheerleader and protector. His evenings were filled with homework help, parent-teacher meetings, and late-night talks when the girls needed advice. He learned to braid hair better than most barbers and to cook soul food that became the centerpiece of their Sunday dinners. But the outside world wasn't always kind. In the early 90s, single black fathers were often judged harshly. Some teachers treated Ronald with suspicion, as if assuming he couldn't properly raise 3 daughters alone. Other parents whispered behind his back, questioning why he had adopted those girls. But Ronald never let the prejudice deter him. "We don't let the world define us," he told the girls. "We define ourselves." Despite the struggles, there were moments of pure joy. Angela made the honor roll for the first time and shyly handed her report card to Ronald, who hugged her so tightly she squeaked. Simone performed in her school's spring concert, singing a solo that left the audience in tears. Dawn won her first track meet, sprinting across the finish line with Ronald cheering so loudly he embarrassed her. Yet, perhaps the most poignant moment came one evening in 1993, when the 3 girls surprised Ronald with a Father's Day gift. They pooled their allowance money to buy a cheap picture frame. Inside it, they placed a family photo taken at the church picnic. Across the bottom, they wrote in glittery letters, "Forever Daddy." Ronald wept as he held the frame. It wasn't about the cost, it was about the declaration. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were a family, stitched together not by blood, but by choice and unshakable love. The teenage years weren't easy. Arguments over curfews, the sting of heartbreaks, the pressures of growing up black in America, but through it all, Ronald's steady hand guided them. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. And that, more than anything, gave the girls the foundation they needed. As the 2000s approached, the Carter sisters stood on the brink of adulthood, ready to chase dreams that once seemed impossible. Ronald could only watch with a mixture of pride and fear, knowing that soon they would spread their wings and face the world on their own. What none of them realized was that the true measure of Ronald's decision in 1985 would not be seen until decades later, when those little girls grew into women, carrying his love as the compass for the rest of their lives. By 2025, nearly 40 years had passed since that November day in 1985 when Ronald Carter had signed the adoption papers for 3 frightened little girls. The world had changed in countless ways, new technologies, new challenges, new possibilities, but one thing had remained constant, the bond that had been forged in that small Atlanta home. Ronald was now 74 years old. His hair had turned snowy white, his once strong frame slightly stooped with age. Yet his eyes still held the same warmth that had reassured Angela, Simone, and Dawn through their darkest childhood nights. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, in a house filled with memories, framed report cards, recital programs, graduation photos, and countless holiday snapshots. His daughters had long since grown and built lives of their own, but they visited often. Every Sunday, without fail, the Carter family gathered around Ronald's dining table, just as they had when they were children. They laughed, argued playfully, told stories, and cooked the same dishes Ronald had once learned to make for them: fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread. Only now, it was the daughters who cooked for him. Angela, the eldest, was 48 now. After years of channeling her fierce energy into academics, she had become a civil rights attorney, fighting tirelessly for marginalized communities. She was known in Atlanta for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue in the courtroom. Yet at home, she was still the same protective sister, often fussing over Ronald's health. She had 2 children of her own, teenagers who adored their grandfather. "Everything I am," Angela once told an audience during a speech, "is because one man refused to give up on me when I was 8 years old." Simone, now 46, had pursued her love of music all the way into adulthood. After studying voice in college, she became a music teacher at a local high school. She also sang in her church choir, her voice still as powerful as the day she belted out Whitney Houston into a hairbrush. Though she never sought fame, she found fulfillment in inspiring young students to believe in themselves. She often told them, "Music saved me when I was lost, and so did my father." Married with 1 son, she balanced family, teaching, and community performances, often dedicating her songs to Ronald. Dawn, the youngest, had perhaps changed the most. At 43, she was a pediatric nurse, known for her gentle touch and ability to comfort even the most anxious children. Her childhood fears of abandonment had transformed into empathy for others, driving her to a career of care. She was married with 3 children, and her youngest daughter bore a striking resemblance to the little girl who once clutched a ragged teddy bear in a foster care center. Dawn often joked, "Dad gave me my forever home, so now I help kids feel safe in theirs." On the 40th anniversary of their adoption, the sisters organized a surprise celebration for Ronald. They rented a banquet hall and invited not only family and friends but also dozens of former students, neighbors, and colleagues whose lives Ronald had touched over the decades. When Ronald walked into the hall, he froze. A banner stretched across the room. 40 years of love. Thank you, Daddy. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked around at the crowd, his daughters, their children, their spouses, and so many others who had become part of his extended family. Angela gave a moving speech, recounting how a man with no obligation had stepped into their lives and chosen to love them unconditionally. Simone sang a song she had written especially for him, her voice trembling with emotion. Dawn, always the most tender-hearted, read aloud the crayon words from that long-ago fridge drawing: "Our family, Daddy plus us." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Ronald, overwhelmed, stood before the audience and spoke softly. "People always asked me back then why I would adopt 3 little girls when I had no wife, no plan, no guarantee I could handle it. The truth is, I didn't rescue them, they rescued me. Those girls gave my life meaning. They taught me that family is not about blood, it's about commitment, love, and never letting go." 40 years after 1985, the Carter family stood as living proof that love could rewrite destiny. 3 little girls who once faced separation and despair had grown into strong, successful women. A man who once felt empty had found his life's greatest purpose. And together, they had built a legacy that would ripple for generations. As the evening ended, Ronald's grandchildren gathered around him, tugging at his hands, asking for stories about when mommy and aunties were little. He smiled, his heart full. Looking at his daughters, now women with families of their own, he whispered to himself the same words he had said the first night they called him Daddy. "We made it. We really made it." And indeed, they had.